Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the 7th album from Kraftwerk, The Man Machine. I remember picking this album up for the first time on iTunes in my early high school days. I already kind of knew what I was getting into then, since the version of the robots from the mix was actually the first Kraftwerk track I'd ever heard back in my early middle school days, and I'd owned this copy of Minimum Maximum from my middle school days as well, which additionally spoiled me to the entire second side, so I'd kind of already heard 2/3 of this album going into it for the first time. Yeah, another one of those albums with heavily varying levels of nostalgia thanks to iTunes availability, but I remember my first reaction to hearing the entire thing in full was, wait, did they re-record this album? It says remastered, so maybe this isn't what it originally sounded like? Because these really don't sound that much different from the versions I'm used to. After all, Trans Europe Express really took me aback initially when I heard that for the first time in middle school, as it sounded a lot more dated than I had expected it to. I was expecting the same results out of hearing The Man Machine for the first time. Nope. That didn't happen. And I was kind of tricked for a bit, because when I bought Radioactivity on iTunes around the same time, that didn't immediately strike me as dated, but that was mainly because I only knew one track prior to listening to it for the first time, being the title track. And that one track wasn't really that far a cry from the Minimum Maximum version either. Of course, now Radioactivity sounds really dated, especially after realizing for this discography review that Trans Europe Express, despite the initial shock, sounded less dated than Radioactivity. I think the point I'm trying to get across here is that The Man Machine doesn't remotely sound dated in any capacity. This album sounded futuristic when I heard the alternate versions as a middle schooler. It sounded futuristic when I picked up the full original album as a high schooler, and it still sounds futuristic to me now reviewing it in 2017. And what blows my mind is that this album came out in 1978. This nearly 40-year-old album was giving me visions of the future, and still does now. The only other album that has a similar kind of effect on me is Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen. That one, I mean, it's light years ahead of everything at the time, but even that one doesn't really make me think of the future. Though granted, that one's instrumental, it doesn't have lyrics about the future, and this one does. Cybernetics and robots and blurring the line between man and machine is still the talk of science fiction now. And I think it's because of this that The Man Machine is probably my favorite Kraftwerk album. It's the one that best exemplifies everything I've ever liked about them. I suppose I should go down track by track to illustrate. There are only 6 songs, so there's not much room for error here, and of course they make use of it excellently. There's not a single track on here that isn't fantastic or I could theoretically mark as the least favorite. Maybe the robots, since I listened to the mixed version too much as a kid, but I mean, come on, it's still the robots. One of Kraftwerk's biggest and most iconic singles. I honestly don't have much to say about this one. Feels like it doesn't really need explaining why I like it. It sounds like what a song about robots should sound like. The melodies are super catchy, the vocoders are fantastically ominous. It's the fucking robots. Now the next 2 tracks, I actually do have more to say, mainly because not only are they the ones with the least nostalgia, when I first heard the original album, they were immediately my favorite 2 tracks. Not sure if they are now. I think I like all 6 songs on here about equally. But what Spacelab and Metropolis lack in nostalgia, they make up for in just how freaking cool they sound. They already sounded pretty awesome just by looking at their titles, and they 100% live up to those titles. Spacelab is probably my favorite between the 2, with its repetitive synth sequences and synth flute-like melodies, the awesome vocoder saying the title, and various other effects. It's really catchy as well, and of course there's the intro, which does sound like you're being beamed up by Scotty or something. And Metropolis, which, you know, is obviously named after the 1927 silent film, which features a robot human called the Maschinenmensch. That's pretty fitting, if I have to say so myself. That one admittedly doesn't have as cool an intro. It starts out kind of slow and creepy, which, you know, I mean, it is cool, but not as cool as the whole shooting up into space thing Spacelab does. But once it actually gets going, it really gets going. Right on par with Spacelab atmosphere-wise, but noticeably creepier, made up a lot of the same sounds, and structured similarly, but catchy and easily memorable in its own right. Maybe some people could mark this as a least favorite purely because it can fairly easily be compared to Spacelab and it doesn't quite match up. But no, I can't mark this as a least favorite either, because I still absolutely love its futuristic atmosphere, and it's just as important part of the album as the other 5 tracks on here. Also, it's kind of an underrated gem that you don't see a lot of love for. The Model, on the other hand, is not quite so underrated. Another one of their most iconic singles. Still keeping up that futuristic vibe that the previous tracks had going, with some pretty haunting and creepy melodies, as well as one of the most obvious uses of the orchestra on the album, using some synth choirs on some places. Maybe that synth flute they use on Spacelab and Metropolis and Neon Lights is the orchestron too, I don't know, don't quote me on that. They do actually, I do hear the synth choirs again on Neon Lights, but yes. Now I'll admit it is kind of weird that you have a track about a human model on an album primarily about robots in the future, though there is some weird wording on this track that makes it seem less human. Like when he goes to a nightclub and you can hear them say, "She is looking good for beauty, we will pay." That's really freaking on the nose, don't you think? Maybe he's modeling for an audience of robots? Or maybe the song is also coming from the perspective of a robot? I mean, he does say she's posing for consumer products, which, you know, I wasn't there in 1978, but did people actually say consumer products in everyday speech? Like, that's weirdly technical language, if you ask me. Maybe I'm overanalyzing it, but regardless, The Model is a great song. Then there's Neon Lights, which is the longest track at just under 9 minutes, or just over 9 minutes, depending on what language you have, apparently, but I don't know. Some people have complained that this track goes on too long and gets repetitive, but I am not one of those people. I mean, yes, it is repetitive, but I don't get sick of it. The melodies are catchy as always, and the atmosphere is really quite different from any other Kraftwerk song. It's rather slow, but also it's quite happy and nostalgic sounding. The synths here are really bright and sparkly, and there are some moments that feel a bit empty, but like that big bass wash that comes in with regular intervals. That prevents it from becoming a problem for me. Helps fill in some of that empty space. And maybe it is weird that there's a song about neon lights on an album about robots, but nah, there's a song called Metropolis here too. It can be related that way. And finally, the album's ending is also its title track, bookending the robots pretty well, though this one is much darker. The synth melodies and vocoders are pretty creepy, there's some pretty weird moments in there, and I like the clicking percussion that runs throughout it. I admittedly don't have a lot else to say about this one. I guess I wish it didn't just end in a fade out. But it is just as fantastic a track as all the other ones on here, and it's fitting that a kind of ominous sounding album has probably the most ominous sounding track on it saved for the end. And yeah, that's about as far as individual tracks go. As far as the album as a whole goes, though, I think maybe if there is one thing interesting about this album that also makes it my personal favorite Kraftwerk album, is the fact that I can listen to it repeatedly and not get sick of it. I heard it like 5 times in a row before recording this review today, and I could still probably keep listening to it after this, no problem. I'm just familiar with it enough to have that nostalgia factor, but not too familiar with it to the point of me not being able to get anything out of it years later. It has a unique atmosphere to it that I don't get out of any of the other albums. It has a pretty consistent concept. Its visions of the future are still futuristic nearly 40 years later after its release. And every track on here is probably eligible for consideration on the inevitable Kraftwerk Top 10 list. I really don't know what else to say. It's my personal favorite Kraftwerk album, and I'm overall feeling a solid 9 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.